tariffs of 145% on China, the effects were immediate. U.S. importers canceled orders, forcing many Chinese factories to halt production. Here we can see a shoe factory in China with unsold inventory piling up almost to the ceiling. But just a few weeks later, Trump agreed to pause most of the tariffs for a period of 90 days. This has come as a relief for both U.S. consumers and Chinese producers. During this 90-day period, the tariffs aren't completely removed. They just decreased to 30%. While 30% is a lot lower than 145%, it's still very high by normal standards. This will almost certainly have significant implications for China's exports to the U.S., which totals almost $500 billion per year. And America isn't the only trading relationship that China has to worry about. Many countries, including developing countries, have grown increasingly worried about China's industrial overcapacity, which is extremely difficult for domestic producers to compete with. Recently, both Indonesia and Vietnam have banned the Chinese e-commerce platform to move for very reason. The European Union is also considering raising its tariffs on China. This is in part due to fears that American tariffs will cause Chinese exporters to dump their products in other parts of the world at ever-decreasing prices. This all comes at a very bad time for the world's second-largest economy. According to official statistics, the Chinese economy is growing strongly at about 5% per year. But economic difficulties are starting to become apparent. Most concerning is youth unemployment, which now sits at 17%. In this video, we'll explain how the recent trade wars expose weaknesses in China's export-driven economy, and what, if anything, they can do to solve this. The new age of protectionism will yield massive changes, both in the global economy and the stock market. There are thousands of publicly traded companies. Some will be winners, and some will be losers. But if you want to find the winners, where should you even start? My favorite tool for the job is Investing Pro, the new flagship product from investing.com. It's a powerful AI-driven tool that gives you access to lots of data and information at the click of a button. One of their coolest features is Warren AI, which you can think of as a ChatGPT for investors. What makes it better than ChatGPT is that's backed by investing.com's data, so you get the most up-to-date and precise market insights. Here I asked it to find me a US-based manufacturing company that will benefit from Trump's China tariffs. It quickly found Powell Industries, a manufacturer of electrical equipment. I then asked it to give me more details about the company and show me its recent financial results. This prompted it to give me a more detailed description of the company's operations and consolidate a plethora of financial data into easy-to-understand observations. Had it not been for Warren AI's insights, I would never have found out about this company. So it's an invaluable tool to start your research. We've partnered with investing.com to give you 15% off your first Investing Pro subscription. Just click the link in the video description to get started today. And now back to the video. Let's start off by looking at where things stand today in terms of the US-China trade war. Back in 2018, during his first term, Trump already imposed tariffs against China, although these were limited to certain product categories including solar panels, washing machines, steel, and aluminum. The tariffs range from 15% to 25%. The majority of these 2018 tariffs remain in effect to this day. Also, in late 2024, the Biden administration imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. This is why no Chinese EVs are sold in the U.S. Now we have 30% tariffs on all Chinese imports. However, there's a partial exemption for smartphones and computers, which only pay a 20% tariff. The second big change is the elimination of the so-called de minimis exception. It used to be the case that packages shipped into the U.S. valued at less than $800 were exempt from any tariffs whatsoever. Chinese e-commerce companies, including Shein and Temu, benefit tremendously from this. Trump recently eliminated the de minimis exception. Not only that, but these small packages are now tariffed at a higher 4% rate, although you also have the option of paying a $100 flat fee instead. This can bring the effective tariff rate down to 12.5% if the package value is $799.99. These new tariffs will likely be disastrous for both Temu and Xi'an. There are so many different tariffs on so many different product categories that have changed so many times it can be hard to keep track of. So let's boil it down to the basics. Up until recently, most Chinese products had 0 tariffs. Now all Chinese products have tariffs ranging from 20% to 100%. So how bad will this be for China? In 2024, China exported $440 billion worth of goods to the U.S. This will almost certainly decrease substantially, but China's reliance on U.S. trade has already been declining anyway. Before 2018, North America represented a little over 18% of China's total exports. By 2023, this had fallen to 14%. We don't yet have data for 2024. Part of decline can be explained by Trump's 2018 tariffs, but another reason is that other countries have been increasing their purchases of Chinese products. If we look back at 2016, the majority of China's exports went to 3 regions: North America, East Asia, and Western Europe. This is not terribly surprising. These 3 regions contain most of the so-called developed countries, like the United States, Britain, Germany, Japan, etc. Consumers in these countries are wealthy and can afford to buy a lot of Chinese-made products. In 2016, these 3 developed regions accounted for 56% of China's total exports. By 2023, this had fallen to just 46%. The so-called developing world is increasingly important to China. Southeast Asia increased from 11 to 14%. South and Central America increased from 5 to 7%. The Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe increased from 9 to 13%. Why did I lump together the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe? It's because all 3 of these regions are vary in terms of their trading relations with China. The Middle East, Russia, and Central Asia all have vast amounts of oil, natural gas, and other minerals, which they export to China in very large quantities. But they don't have very much in the way of manufacturing. So they are more than happy to export natural resources to China and get Chinese consumer goods in return. This is a symbiotic trading relationship which has been increasing over time. Now let's turn our attention to South America and Southeast Asia. These are relatively poor regions, but their economies are quickly from a small base. As incomes in these countries rise, people can afford to buy more Chinese-made stuff. Another factor is the rise of Chinese automobiles, especially EVs. In 2016, China imported about as many cars as it exported. Over the past 6 years, imports have decreased and exports have skyrocketed. In 2023, China recorded net vehicle exports of $160 billion. This growth has mostly come from places like South America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. China exports 0 EVs to the US and only a small amount to the EU. Thanks to tariffs and other restrictions, Chinese automobile exports have also been surging in Russia as they replace Western automobile brands that left following the Ukraine war. One thing that's kind of surprising is China's massive and growing trade surplus with Southeast Asia. In 2016, China's trade surplus was $80 billion. Over the next 6 years, exports grew much faster than imports. The surplus more than doubled to $164 billion in 2023. The reason this is surprising is because China and Southeast Asia have a lot of overlap in what they produce. For example, both are major producers of textiles. Wages in China are significantly higher than in Southeast Asia. The average urban worker in China makes the equivalent of about $800 per month. By comparison, the average urban worker in Indonesia makes about $360 per month, so less than half. Given that wages are so much cheaper, you might expect that Southeast Asia can produce low-end consumer goods at a more competitive cost. If so, you would also expect Southeast Asia to be a net exporter to China, but the opposite is the case. What can explain the seeming contradiction? China's technological development has increased massively over the past decade. In recent years, we've seen the rise of so-called dark factories in China. They use a very high degree of automation to make things like textiles. They are called dark factories because sometimes you can even turn off the light to save electricity because the automated machines don't need light. Instead of large numbers of unskilled textile workers, you now need a much smaller number of skilled technicians to operate and maintain the advanced machinery. This has allowed Chinese exporters to undercut Southeast Asian competitors on price despite the higher labor costs. Many Southeast Asian nations now fear that intense competition from China is hampering their own economic development. Recently, both Indonesia and Vietnam banned Temu for this reason. Even as China's economy is rapidly developed, they remain very reliant on export. Their total trade surplus with the rest of the world increased from $625 billion in 2016 to almost $1 trillion in 2023. The surplus has gotten so big as to become unsustainable. Countries from America to Southeast Asia are less and less willing to soak up China's excess output. But ironically, there is one massive market that China's thus far failed to adequately conquer. That's the 1.4 billion consumers living within its own borders. Final consumption represents 55% of China's GDP. That means that Chinese people in aggregate only consume 55% of what they produce. For comparison, the American people consume more than 80% of what they produce. Germany, which is an export-focused nation, consumes 75% of what it produces. India, which is a developing nation, consumes about 70% of what it produces. The point is, China's low level of consumption is highly unusual. So why is this the case? China only consumes 55% of what it produces. What happens to the other 45%? Part of this can be explained by the very high personal savings rate. China lacks a strong social safety net, so people prefer to save a larger percentage of their income in the case of a job loss or unexpected medical expenses. Chinese people are also more likely to save up money to buy a house in cash instead of getting a mortgage. This is partly due to a less well-developed banking system and partly due to conservative attitudes towards personal debt. However, the cautious consumer is only part of the story. Another problem is that a lot of China's GDP never enters a pocket of consumers in the first place. A large portion of China's GDP is created by massive state-owned enterprises. These state-owned enterprises have two purposes. Firstly, they generate profits for the government, which partially offsets the need for tax revenue. However, this is not their primary purpose. The primary purpose of the state-owned enterprises is to invest into the Chinese economy and achieve the goals of the central planners. To quantify this, let's look at the Bank of China, which is one of the largest state-owned banks in China. It's owned by the Chinese government, but some of its shares are listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Each year, when the bank makes a profit, they need to decide how much of this profit to distribute to shareholders versus how much should be reinvested to grow their loan book. In a normal year, approximately 30% of its profits are returned to shareholders in the form of dividends and share repurchases. In 2020, their shareholder return was actually negative as they issued new shares to strengthen their balance sheet during the pandemic. By comparison, J.P. Morgan, the largest bank in the U.S., typically 50 to 60% of its profits to shareholders. In some years, they return almost all their profits to shareholders. The state-run banks reinvest their profits to issue loans for new infrastructure projects, factories, and anything else that can grow the economy. These investments increase the productive capacity of the economy, but also diverts money away from consumers. This creates a mismatch whereby China has massive industrial capacity, but Chinese consumers don't have enough money to buy all of it. That's why they've been so reliant on exports. In an effort to maximize productivity, Chinese factories have increasingly turned to robotics and automation, such as fewer human workers are needed. This has created an unintended consequence of very high youth unemployment. Currently, 17% of 16 to 24-year-olds in China are unemployed. This actually understates the scale of the problem, as many youths have returned to university because they can't find a job. If you're a full-time student, you won't be counting the unemployment statistics. This has led to bizarre situations in some Chinese cities where they are now office buildings where you can pay a few dollars a day to pretend you have a job. Often Chinese youths move from their hometown and the countryside to attend university in a big city. After graduating, they can't find a job. Unwilling to face the disgrace of unemployment, they take photos of themselves in the fake office to post on social media. This way, they can trick their friends and family into thinking they have a job. In the US, 80% of jobs are in the service sector. A service sector job is anything where you're not creating a physical product. This everything from waiters to investment bankers to people who make YouTube videos. Service sector jobs are typically not conducive to exporting, so they rely almost entirely on domestic demand. For the reasons we discussed earlier, China has insufficient domestic demand, thereby leading to a weak services sector. As China has gotten richer, the number of service jobs has been gradually increasing. But it still only sits at 46%, which is very low compared to other advanced economies. The increasing international backlash against China's overcapacity should serve as a wake-up call. China needs to increase domestic consumption so as to boost service sector employment. This is probably the right thing to do anyway, even without tariffs. The whole point of economic growth is to increase the living standards of the people. What's the point of building a massive industrial capacity if your people can't even afford to enjoy it? The Chinese government realizes this. In March, they announced a number of special initiatives to boost domestic consumption. Some of the plans make sense, such as increasing the minimum in directing state-run banks issue more personal loans. But some of their other plans are frankly bizarre. For example, they say, quote, China will accelerate the development and application of new technologies and products including autonomous driving, smart wearables, ultra-high-definition video, brain-computer interfaces, robotics, and additive manufacturing, more commonly known as 3D printing, to create new high-growth consumption sectors. Support will be given to ice and snow resource-rich regions to help them develop into globally recognized winter tourism destinations. Unquote. If you're interested in reading the full press release, I've included a link in the video description. It's one of the most bizarre press releases I've read from any government. They want to provide subsidies to high-tech industries, such as robotics and brain-computer interfaces. At least in the short to medium term, this will reduce consumption as government-funded R&D diverts resources away from consumers. I'm not saying that subsidizing new technologies is necessarily a bad idea, but the fact that they're using this as an attempt to increase shows a complete lack of understanding of the root problems. Another part of their plan is to somehow promote domestic tourism to the northern parts of China that have a lot of snow and ice. Maybe this can work, but the fact that the Polar Bureau is trying to influence where people go for winter vacations is probably a sign that your economic planning is too centralized. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video. What do you think about Chinese economy and the new age of tariffs? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, thank you so much and we'll see you in the next one.